This is Reino's podcast, The Creative Mindset. Hi everyone, welcome to The Creative Mindset, a podcast about what the future holds at the intersection of creativity and technology. I am Reino Moro, the founding partner of IANCO, a global innovation firm based in New York and Tokyo. Today's episode is Ask Me Anything, where we take questions from our listeners and invite one of them onto our show to have a real-time conversation. Today's question came from Alice Kumagami, an up-and-coming graphic designer who recently relocated from London to Tokyo. She was introduced to me by a good friend of mine a few months ago, and at the time she was still based in London but had decided to relocate to Japan. However, she didn't have a job lined up, and even though she grew up speaking with her parents in Japanese at home in London, she never lived or worked in Japan. By the time Alice and I caught up for this recording, she relocated to Japan and just started a new chapter of her career in a foreign land. So, let's get started.
Ask me anything.
So Alice, good to see you online.
Thank you for having me.
Where do we find you?
I'm coming in from Tokyo, which is very exciting because that's very different to where I spoke to you last time.
That's right. So just to quickly give the listeners an image of how we met in the first place was an introduction from a really good friend of mine who is a creative director based in London, Flo. And he was kind enough to introduce you to me because back then, it was last year, back in the fall of 2023, you were interested in moving to Japan. And that's where we ended the conversation 7, 8, 9 months ago. And since then, you've moved not only to Japan, but you've moved within Japan. So give us an update of what you've been up to, and ask away.
Yeah, so I guess I've pretty much been a Londoner since the age of 8. I was working at a creative agency called Mr. President. They were really lovely. But I kind of had an identity crisis of being Japanese and not having lived in Japan, which is when I kind of asked Flo to introduce me to Ray. And since the last time we spoke, I'm now in Tokyo. I'm not only moved to another country to work, but I've also moved in-house. Before I was at a creative agency. I'm now at On, which is like kind of a sportswear brand.
Yes.
So a lot of changes has happened.
Wow. 8 months. It's a whole, literally you're on the other side of the world.
Exactly.
So Alice, if you wouldn't mind giving a quick overview of your career.
Yes.
And today's conversation, at least the reason why you reached out to me was even though you have the Japanese heritage, it's really the first time, you had been to Japan, but it's really the first time that you're living in Japan.
Yeah.
And you wanted to ask me about working across different cultures, different languages, and different borders. But before getting into that, do you mind giving a quick overview of your career and what took you to where you are now?
Yeah, so I kind of always knew I wanted to go into graphic design. And so I started studying graphic arts at Winchester School of Art. And then during my second and third year, I was introduced to a recruiter about Mr. President. At that time, I had no idea, to be honest, what a creative agency was. And I kind of wanted to go into kind of branding. So then, because my tutor suggested it, I kind of applied to it. Yeah, luckily it was incredibly fun. It was kind of quite a nice eye-opener as to what the industry was about. And luckily they wanted me back after graduating. And so, after graduating university, I went back as a junior. And then I kind of worked my way through becoming a midway and then a senior. And I'd hit my 5-year mark at Mr. President. They're such lovely people and very much so in contact with them. On a personal side, I had a very strong kind of identity crisis of being Japanese but having never worked in Japan and what that kind of meant for me. And so I kind of took the 5-year benchmark as a good opportunity to switch things up. I've kind of just taken that on full throttle and moved to an in-house team as well.
So since moving to Japan, you moved to Japan in September or maybe a little bit later in 2023? October.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what has your time been like since then?
So I kind of took a mini career break to be with my grandma, which is really lovely. And then I was kind of freelancing for the people at Mr. P, which was amazing as well. And then in between, I was applying for jobs. I kind of, didn't have anything lined up because it was much easier to look for a job locally. And so I kind of was searching pretty much every day, but a lot of the agencies would or kind of places I wanted to work were very Japanese.
Mm.
And I'm not sure, how many of your listeners know, but Japanese companies are very much known for being quite strict and kind of rule following, which basically was the complete opposite to my, career experience.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was quite terrifying to kind of think,
Mm.
not only am I moving to another company, but I'm also potentially moving into a culture working culture that could be quite strict.
Were you born in Japan?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you talked about how strict a Japanese, especially corporate culture can be.
Yeah.
But would you say that your upbringing was quintessentially Japanese, or were your parents, what was your household more westernized or British/English?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good question. And I think that's probably where my identity crisis comes from. At home, I speak to my parents in Japanese because they, that we're all based in London. And so I'd say my house is very much like a Osaka, strong dialect, kind of just chatting to each other all the time. Whereas, outside of home, it's very much English. So
Yeah.
I have like a dual identity, and I would kind of often code switch depending on where I was and who I was with.
Yeah, that's interesting. I went through some of that myself, although my parents sent us overseas. They didn't move with us. My brothers and I went to a boarding school and then college. So, and we were in Japan I was in Japan until I was 15. So I had a good decade and a half of my upbringing in Japan. So I didn't have this dual cultural balance that you were striking when you were growing up in London.
Yeah.
But did you feel in the professional, once you got out of school, was there, I would assume that when you were growing up as a student, there were some cultural nuances and differences that you had to balance. But, since we're talking about your professional career, were there moments when you felt like that cultural difference or even cultural difference became a conflict in either internally within you or the way you worked with your colleagues?
I think this is something that I've always been quite curious about, is that I think there are several elements to me being quite Japanese, or if anything, like people from Osaka are known as being quite like, what's the word? In Japanese, it's sekkachi, which means like you're rushing all the time. You just want to get things done.
Yeah.
And also, like being Japanese is like very like neat and having things organized. And I think those elements played a massive role in who I am as a designer.
Interesting.
I think my strong point as a designer is attention to detail. I kind of pick up on the like little nuances and the final details, which I think is quite a Japanese thing, not to stereotype, but Western cultures are much better at kind of looking at the bigger picture and what the creative idea is. Whereas I always saw myself as someone that was quite good at kind of seeing the final executions. Is everything where they need to be? Is everything perfect?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I definitely think my cultural kind of identity had a play in that, but I didn't know whether that was just me stereotyping my cultures or whether that was just kind of like a global experience. So it'd be great to know if you kind of have a similar experience.
Yeah, I've always strongly identified myself as a Japanese designer. My career started in Japan. As I mentioned earlier, I was in Japan until I was 15. And then when I was 16, I went to Europe to go to high school. I went to and finished college in the US. But the first professional working experience that I had was in Japan under a Japanese designer. And it was so, and this is in the 90s, I'm a few years older than you, a little bit more than a few years older than you. So it was in the 1990s, or 25 years ago. It was really tough. I mean, I was doing multiple all-nighters a week. I would go to the office at 11 a.m. and I would work until like quite literally until 6 a.m. the next day. I would go home, I would take a shower, and I would sleep maybe like an hour and a half and then get back on the train and go work. And I would do that at least 3 times a week. It was just brutal. And it was an internship. So, I knew that it was going to end soon. And I think that's why I was able to do. But at the same time, I was like, I don't think I can work in an environment like this. Mm-hmm. And in the 90s, the creative industry, the advertising industry, the marketing industry, working like that was not an unusual thing. It was relatively common.
Mm.
So I was too much of a wimp to survive and thrive in the Japanese corporate culture. So I decided to, like I want to start my career in the US.
Mm-hmm.
I graduated from school and I moved to New York at the end of in the 90s. And I got my first job as a designer in 98, 99, I think. Now, fast forward, I started coming to Japan or going to Japan around 2010, 2011. My first professional return, mild return, was opening an office in Tokyo for the previous agency that I used to work for, AKQA. So I would travel every couple months or so to meet with people, to interview people, to work with clients. And then I want to say around that time, there was a very famous incident in Japan where a young professional working in the advertising industry unfortunately committed suicide because it was just so brutal for her and for other people. That was a sticker shock to the Japanese creative industry, but also to Japan as an economy, as a professional society. And people, it was quite literally a wake-up call, for the Japanese society. And then since then, it has gotten tremendously better when it comes to working hours. Yeah. But anyway, that was kind of a long-winded background and cultural and historical context. But I guess what I'm sharing with you is, in a different way, I had a cultural shock that I had to adjust. Being a Japanese person, having grown up in Japan, but then moving to the States, after for college, and then spending probably the first decade or more, about a decade or so of my career in the US. So I would say my reintroduction to my own culture, at least in a professional sense, had a lot of cushion that I could fall back on.
Yeah.
Because even though I was Japanese and I speak Japanese, I was working for a Western company. And there was that kind of fair, or not, probably more unfair than fair. But I think there was that kind of buffer that Japanese corporations and Japanese business people gave to Western people and Western corporations.
Yeah, for sure. The thing is also just quite interesting as to how different companies, kind of Western companies and Japanese companies, judge professional skill or professional kind of talent. When I was applying for any kind of agencies based in Japan, and a lot of them may have international names, but they're very much like a Japanese company. A lot of them I'd often get, through my experience, luckily I became senior quite early. They kind of question that. And so they would, they'd ask my salary expectations or what my title that I was looking for, and whether I was talking to recruiters or kind of talent acquisition from the companies, they'd often be quite, not shocked, I guess shocked is the most appropriate word of, oh, well, you're only this age. Why are you looking for this salary and this title when that's your age? Whereas I've never had that kind of experience. Back in London, it was kind of, we see your portfolio, we see your value, we either like you, we don't like you. And I guess, it was there were a lot of kind of culture shocks, which I already knew about the working culture, but kind of over time, work kind of being assumed and it being part of your salary. And there were loads of little nuances that kind of was such a big culture shock to me.
Interesting.
And so, luckily through kind of chance, On has been a company I've been kind of interested in their design work for a while. I saw that they were looking for a graphic designer. And so I applied, but through chatting to them, because they're Swiss based, they have kind of the really similar mentalities to kind of an agency, kind of any agency that I've known about in London of, you do the work, we're happy. We're not going to kind of micromanage you. Make sure that you are clocking in at this time and clocking out at that time. And I think in some way that kind of allows, especially from a creative mindset, you can't really control when you're going to have these amazing ideas. It kind of gives that person a bit more kind of freedom to focus on creativity rather than following rules.
Yeah. Well, the company that you're working for, On, which is a running shoe company, the Japan office or Japan corporation, is that run by mostly Westerners or have they localized?
They fully localize, but which is quite comforting is a lot of the people that work here either half Japanese with another country or they've lived abroad at some point of their life.
Yeah.
And so I don't feel like an outsider. I feel very much like,
Sure.
these are my people.
Yeah. I was often the only, if not one of the very few Japanese people working in any environment. When I first moved to New York more than 25 years ago, I didn't quite know how to, I was in my early 20s and I was just trying to find some kind of landing when I moved to New York, and getting a job in the first place was really, really tough. I interviewed at so many different places. I sent many, many resumes, more than probably easily 100 resumes. And then when I finally landed a gig, I believe I was the only Japanese person. In hindsight, either consciously or to some extent subconsciously, I feel like I was trying to tone down my Japanese-ness and suppress my Japanese quality and trying to fit in. I knew that, and English is not my first language. By that point, I had spent maybe about 5 years in the US. So I could have a conversation, but I could not have a sophisticated conversation or professional conversation. Yeah. So I knew that I was working from a disadvantaged place.
Mm.
And I felt like by suppressing my Japanese quality is the way to overcome my disadvantage. And I would say it took until my, I would say, late 20s to feel comfortable in my own skin, being a Japanese person. I think the first big break, and that made me feel like, okay, I can transcend the cultural differences and language barriers, is when I received a Young Guns Award from the Art Directors Club. And then I think I was 29, just right before I turned 30. That gave me enough confidence. Okay, like I'm finally recognized beyond my disadvantages and limitations that I had as a Japanese designer. And I'm recognized as a designer, not as a Japanese designer, but as a designer.
Mm.
Yeah. It took a while.
Wow. So interesting.
Yeah. You started your career in London,
Mm-hmm.
and that's your home. English is pretty much your first, or very close to your first language. You didn't have any of the language barriers, but I guess moving to Japan, what kind of cultural differences or cultural barriers have you felt? You talked about a little bit about the strictness of Japanese corporate Japan.
Yeah, I think it wasn't necessarily experiencing the strictness of it. I think, people who aren't even from Japan know about the working cultures and potentially, the harmful working conditions some people are in. And so this fear just kind of manifested in myself of, am I going to fit in? And from my perspective, or like in general, this is a mad stereotype, but, people from Osaka are seen as quite loud, especially from people who are kind of more from Tokyo. And then also people who have been brought up abroad are also quite seen as like arrogant and quite outspoken. And so these kind of negative traits that people kind of stereotype with has always kind of been I guess, fear when I come to a different country, move back to Japan. Am I going to fit into the stereotype? Are people going to find it difficult to work with me because of these things? Because I think from my perspective, these are really good traits of mine. I think being able to be outspoken and being able to kind of call things out when they should be called out is a good thing. But there was obviously very much a fear. Now, having said that, I now work for a Swiss-based brand, and they are very lovely and they are very much on the same mentality as kind of Western companies. And so I haven't actually felt any sort of all the fears that I thought I was going to, experience. I haven't felt, luckily.
Yeah. I would say I think I spent my 20s trying to overcome my own fear of being not just Japanese, but foreign in the US. I was still finding my way around. I didn't know if I would make it in this industry and would be able to build a career. There were a lot of designers and creatives that I looked up to and idealized them, to be my icons, so to speak. And that was how I spent my 20s and trying to see if I can prove to myself and to the world, hey, I can do good work. I feel in my 30s, because I got into a position at a relatively young age of being a leader. And in my 20s, I feel like I lacked enough mentorship support I had these people that I looked up to, but I don't feel like I had enough mentorship that I could solicit from people around me. So I struggled quite a bit in my 20s, and in my 30s, without enough mentorship that I didn't receive. However, I was pushed into a leadership role at a relatively young age, and I started working at a company that was quite international. In my 20s, I was at RGA, which back then was a very New York centric American agency. So I mean, there were some international people, but it was very New York and very American. And then when I was about to turn 30, I joined this agency called AKQA. And even though it was based in the US, my first creative partner was Danish. And then my second creative partner when I moved to San Francisco was Brazilian. And a lot of the people around me, yeah, of course, they all spoke English, but, a British person, Brazilian person, a Danish person, American, so it was quite international. And on top of that, they were expanding globally very quickly. So I spent my 30s trying to learn how to be a leader, but also managing people from multiple backgrounds. And on top of that, opening offices in different places, China, Shanghai, Tokyo, Paris, Amsterdam, Berlin, Brazil. So I was having to wear multiple hats and going to different places. Now that I'm talking about this, and now that you asked me this question about the cultural differences, is contrary to my 20s when I spent my decade trying to diminish my own identity. I think in my 30s, I understood that, okay, having these differences is the starting point. That was the first big acceptance that I had to have is, okay, this person is from Brazil. He comes from a very different from a very different background. This person is from England. This person is from this place, that place. And even though we are using the same language, common language of English, just accepting that we are different was the starting point.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing I'm kind of grateful for having experienced this now is that, especially within the design world, like when female designers are quite rare for some reason, even though in uni there were a lot more, girls than there were guys. And so I always kind of had this double minority of not only being a person of color, but also being a woman as a designer. And, I've loved my colleagues, but all the designers I've ever worked with have been male, which has been, as a concept, quite wild to think about. I worked at a very small agency, so there's not a lot. But then luckily I had two mentors, both female. One is a female designer. And it was so empowering to kind of look up to her, which kind of played in I think I kind of got to speed track your kind of decade experience of going, this is kind of the diversity is the strength of us. And so I definitely made it, I think, as I got older and I guess became more confident in my position with kind of promotions and stuff, it definitely made it more of a thing to have these, different experiences or different perspectives. I made it such a thing to be vocal about it. Because I think that is what makes creativity and what, especially within advertising, that's what makes it more interesting.
Yeah. It sounds like you had a role model who was also a direct mentor that you could work with and you could work under, who happens to be female. I don't know if she was a person of color or not, but still something that you could identify with, and having that person as again, either a direct mentor or a role model at a distance that, you might not have access to. But now that you mention it, I wasn't fortunate enough to have a steady set of mentors that I could learn from directly. So now you have people that you can look up to, whether because of the gender aspect or your cultural heritage perspective. But, one day you may be filling the role of being the role model for others. So I think that what you just said about having a female boss was empowering. And I think that's a really important thing for people to realize.
Yeah, I think Japanese creatives working within a Western space is such a rare thing.
Yeah. I think this topic of your own cultural heritage as it relates to one's profession is a really interesting topic. And I think it's also important to be sensitive to what that cultural background might give us, both in terms of advantage and disadvantage. There's certain situations that might give, and I think we should be aware of advantage that could be privilege for us, right? But also disadvantage because of the cultural baggage that we might have and the stereotypes that other people might push on us. I think we should be extremely aware of the suppression that might come from it. So, a non-Asian person telling you or telling me, oh, you're an Asian person, you must be good at it. So you do the work as opposed to me, non-Asian person doing the work. That's just not acceptable. And as people, whether we are Asians or not, or other people, I don't think as a person, we should be subservient to the cultural stereotypes that others might cast on us.
Yeah, definitely.
So that was Ask Me Anything from Alice Kumagami, a designer who decided to take a chance on herself and relocated to a foreign land to build her career. Today's conversation wasn't really about Japan or working in Japan. Rather, it's about working out the differences between identities, cultures, and values. Something that I had to deal with throughout my life and career growing up and working in different countries. The questions she shared with us were, what was my experience like working in agencies in different countries with different working cultures? Do I feel like my cultural identity has played a role in working in different cities and countries? And as an industry, is this something we should be encouraging more, or do I feel like that's where we lose cultural uniqueness? Some of these questions I do think about, but some I hadn't thought about before, so it was a useful conversation for me to have and to be aware of my own identity. Today's takeaway from my conversation with Alice, however, had less to do with cultures and identity, more to do with how one might think about the future of our careers. Towards the end of my conversation with Alice, I asked her where she sees herself 5 years from now. She said that this was the same question that I asked her several months ago when I first spoke to her online. She thought about it a little bit and she said she didn't know. In the past, she thought about where she wanted to be a few years from that point in time. And even though things may not have turned out the way she had envisioned, it still was a great turnout for her. And she was at peace with the fact that the plan didn't go necessarily accordingly, but that didn't mean that the plan didn't work out. It was still a great result for her, and she was happy with the difference between her previous vision and the way things turned out. So this time, moving to a different country, initially, she didn't even know what she was going to do, but she landed in a place where she feels very happy with. And moving forward from here, she's also not planning too much, focus on what's in front of her right now and let that take her to wherever it could take her to. I'm somebody who's always thought about my future, and in my case, I've thought about my career in a 5-year increment. I tried to stick with what I was doing for close to 5 years in order to build my career for the next 5 years. And looking back, that worked out for me well, or at least I think anyway. And I tried to encourage people to think about what they would like to see themselves or where they would like to see themselves in 5 years from now, so that what they do today can be the foundation of where they could go 5 years from now. But talking with and listening to Alice, it gave me a different perspective that perhaps it's okay not to know where you want to be in 5 years because nobody can predict the future. And what you can do is to do the best you can do today so that becomes the building blocks for your future tomorrow. 10 years ago, there were a lot of things changing. Now, there are even more things changing, whether it's technology, society, and other factors that we can't really control. Nobody can predict the future. The best that we can do is to do what we can within our control, really focus on what you're doing today so that tomorrow can be better. What you can do today is to do the best you can do at that point. And tomorrow, all you should think about is what you did yesterday, what you were yesterday, who you were yesterday, and see if you can improve maybe just 1% from the version of yourself from yesterday. And really focus on that because everything else is somewhat out of our control. So that was the takeaway from my conversation with Alice Kumagami, an up-and-coming designer from Britain who recently started a new chapter in her career. If you're listening to this on Spotify, there's a Q&A field, so please do send us your questions and comments. And if you like our podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating. We'll be so grateful. I'm Reinamoto, and this is The Creative Mindset. See you next time.